The bridge wasn't decorative. It wasn't some rustic feature built for charm or views. It was functional, engineered, permitted, and privately owned. A reinforced steel and timber crossing spanning a narrow ravine on my land, built years ago to support farm equipment and emergency access. According to the engineer's specs, it was rated for light trucks and tractors, not commercial tankers, not semis, and definitely not anything weighing 40 tons. Everyone knew that, especially the HOA. There were signs posted on both ends. Weight limits, private property warnings, reflective markers. You'd have to be willfully careless or deliberately reckless to ignore all of it, which is exactly why what happened next still feels unreal. I wasn't home when the call came in. A neighbor panicked, telling me I needed to check my cameras immediately. Something about a tanker truck. Something about a loud crack. Something about the bridge. I pulled over, opened my phone, and loaded the 4K feed. The footage started calmly. Clear afternoon light. Birds whined through the trees. Then, from the far edge of the frame, a massive 40-ton water tanker rolled into view. Industrial. Oversized. Completely out of place on a private, rural access road. Behind the wheel was a contracted driver. Standing nearby, pointing confidently toward the bridge, the HOA president. I watched her gesture. Watched her wave the truck forward. Watched the driver hesitate, then proceed. The tanker rolled onto the bridge slowly at first, the structure flexing under weight it was never designed to carry. Then came the sound, sharp, final, unmistakable. The central support failed. The deck buckled. One side dropped violently. The tanker slammed to a stop just before tipping, its rear axles still on solid ground, its front suspended over open air. Wood splintered. Steel groaned. The bridge didn't collapse entirely, but it was destroyed beyond use. And the whole thing was captured in perfect 4K. I sat there on the side of the road, watching it again and again. The signs were visible. The warnings were clear. The president never once checked for permission, load limits, or ownership. She simply decided that because she wanted access for HOA utility work, as I'd later learn, my bridge was fair game. It wasn't. I'd built that bridge after a costly easement dispute years earlier. Every permit was in order. Every inspection passed. The bridge existed precisely because the HOA had no right of access through my land. That boundary had already been settled in writing, which meant this wasn't an accident. It was a decision. By the time I got home, emergency vehicles were already there. The driver was shaken but unharmed. The tanker was stuck. And the HOA president was doing what she did best, talking loudly, confidently, and incorrectly. She told responders it was a community access bridge. She claimed verbal permission. She insisted the HOA had authority. None of that mattered, because authority doesn't override property rights, and confidence doesn't outweigh evidence. I walked past her without saying a word and went straight to the responding officer. I showed him the footage. The signs, the permits, the engineering report with the clearly stated weight limits. He watched silently. Then he looked at the bridge. Then back at her. "This is private property," he said flatly. "And this vehicle never should have been on that structure." Her face changed. For the first time, she realized this wasn't an internal HOA issue she could intimidate her way through. This was destruction of private infrastructure. Trespass. Negligence. And it was all on video. She thought she could force access. She thought the bridge would hold. She thought no one would stop her. She was wrong. By the next morning, the bridge site looked less like a neighborhood dispute and more like an accident investigation. Yellow tape marked the perimeter. The tanker was still stranded, immobilized until engineers could assess whether it could be safely removed without triggering a full collapse. County inspectors arrived first, followed closely by the HOA's insurance adjuster, who took one look at the posted weight limit signs and went very quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just documented. I provided the bridge's original permits, engineering load ratings, inspection certificates, and maintenance records. Everything was current. Everything was clean. The bridge hadn't failed due to neglect. It had failed because someone ignored clear structural limits and forced 40 tons of steel and water onto it. The driver admitted on record that he'd expressed concern before crossing. He'd been told by the HOA president herself that the bridge was approved and safe for access. That statement alone shifted the tone of the entire investigation. Because now this wasn't just damage. It was inducement. The county engineer explained it plainly. Even if the bridge hadn't collapsed, routing a tanker across private infrastructure without permission violated multiple codes. When it did collapse, liability became unavoidable. The only remaining question was who would be paying. The HOA president tried to regain control. She insisted the bridge served community needs, claimed there was an implied easement, suggested my documentation was outdated. None of it held up. The property records showed no access rights. The easement dispute years earlier had ended decisively in my favor. She knew that. She'd been on the board when it happened. That detail mattered, because it proved intent. By afternoon, the HOA's insurer issued a reservation of rights letter. Translation: they were preparing to deny coverage. Intentional misuse of private property wasn't something they were eager to absorb, especially when it came with video evidence and posted warnings. That's when the calls started. Board members, contractors, even residents who had never spoken to me before. Everyone wanted reassurance that they wouldn't be financially responsible. I told them the truth. I didn't know yet. But I also didn't sugarcoat it. If the HOA claimed authority, they owned the consequences. The bridge engineer delivered his assessment the following day. The central beam had suffered catastrophic stress failure. Repair wasn't an option. The structure would have to be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. Cost estimates came in higher than anyone expected. Materials, labor, environmental stabilization of the ravine below. 6 figures. Easily. The HOA president stopped returning calls. She didn't attend the emergency board meeting that night. Instead, her attorney appeared remotely, attempting to frame the incident as a misunderstanding. The board wasn't buying it. Too many people had now seen the footage. Too many facts were fixed. The county issued a formal notice. The HOA president was prohibited from directing any further work near my property. Access denied. Authority revoked pending review. And just like that, her power evaporated. What she thought was a shortcut turned into a dead end. What she treated as a minor inconvenience became a documented failure. And what she assumed would be handled quietly was now attracting attention from engineers, insurers, and regulators who didn't care about HOA politics. They cared about responsibility. And responsibility, backed by 4K footage, doesn't negotiate. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled less than 48 hours later, and this time, it wasn't optional. Attendance was mandatory. The county had requested minutes. The insurer wanted statements. And the board needed answers they already suspected wouldn't be easy to hear. For the first time since she'd become president, she didn't open the meeting. She sat off to the side, arms folded, jaw tight, while the vice president tried, and failed, to project calm. The room was tense in a way I'd never seen before. Not the usual bickering over paint colors or parking rules. This was fear. Financial fear. When my turn came, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't editorialize. I connected my laptop to the screen and played the footage. Full resolution. Full audio. No cuts. The tanker approaching. The weight limit sign clearly visible. The private bridge, and heavy vehicles, notice bolted to the guardrail. The driver stopping. The HOA president stepping forward and gesturing him on. Her voice audible, telling him it was fine and that she'd take responsibility. Then the crack. The sound alone made several people flinch. Wood snapping. Steel groaning. The bridge dropping just enough to make the danger unmistakable. When the video ended, no one spoke. The HOA's attorney finally broke the silence. That statement, he said slowly, looking toward her, is going to be a problem. She tried to respond. Claimed she meant responsibility as a representative. Said she believed the bridge was stronger than posted. Suggested the signage was outdated. The county engineer shut that down immediately. The signs were current. The permits valid. The bridge rating clearly documented. There was no ambiguity. And then came the line that changed everything. You directed a commercial vehicle onto private infrastructure without permission, he said. That's not an HOA decision. That's a personal one. The board voted before the meeting ended. Unanimous. She was suspended as president pending the outcome of the county and insurance investigations. Her access to HOA funds, authority to direct contractors, and role as point of contact were revoked immediately. She stood up, furious, and accused the board of betrayal. No one responded, because at that point, loyalty wasn't the priority. Survival was. Over the next week, things unraveled fast. The HOA's insurer formally denied coverage for the bridge damage, citing intentional misrepresentation and unauthorized use of private property. The letter was blunt. There would be no payout, no defense, no protection. That liability didn't vanish. It landed squarely where the footage pointed. On her. I filed a civil claim for destruction of private infrastructure, trespass, and loss of use. Not aggressively. Precisely. The bridge wasn't just damaged, it cut off access to part of my land. Equipment couldn't cross. Emergency vehicles couldn't either. Every day it remained unusable at a cost. Discovery made it worse for her. Emails surfaced where she'd complained about my refusal to grant access. Messages where she discussed forcing the issue. Notes about using HOA contractors to solve the bridge problem. She treated the structure as an obstacle. The law treated it as property. Neighbors started asking questions. Not just about the bridge, but about other decisions she'd made unilaterally. Contractors recalled being pressured. Fines were re-examined. Old grievances resurfaced. The bridge had done more than collapse. It had exposed a pattern. By the time her attorney requested mediation, the situation had already shifted beyond damage control. This wasn't about rebuilding wood and steel anymore. It was about accountability, documentation, and the difference between authority and entitlement. She thought directing a truck was a small act. But small acts, when captured clearly and reviewed carefully, have a way of becoming defining ones. And the consequences were only just beginning. Mediation didn't go the way her attorney expected. They arrived with proposals, assumptions, and the quiet confidence that money could smooth everything over. What they didn't arrive with was leverage. By then, the facts were locked. The county had finalized its report, concluding that the bridge failure was caused by gross misuse of private infrastructure after explicit warnings were ignored. The language mattered. Gross misuse removed any gray area. It meant intent. It meant responsibility couldn't be shared, diluted, or quietly reassigned. The estimate to rebuild the bridge landed a week later. Higher than anyone wanted. The ravine required stabilization before construction could even begin. Temporary access would need to be engineered. Materials costs had risen. Environmental mitigation was mandatory because debris had fallen into a protected drainage area. Every line item added weight to the reality she was now facing. 6 figures had become the low end. The HOA board tried to distance itself completely. Publicly, they acknowledged the bridge was private. Privately, they were terrified homeowners would revolt if association funds were even hinted at. Emergency meetings turned into damage control sessions. Attorneys advised transparency. Silence was no longer an option. A formal notice was sent to all residents. It explained the incident. It explained the suspension. And it made one thing very clear. The HOA would not be covering the cost of the destroyed bridge. That's when the pressure turned personal. Residents began confronting her directly. Not angrily, worse. Coldly. Asking whether their dues were at risk. Asking if special assessments were coming. Asking how something this reckless had been allowed to happen. She had no good answers. The county added another complication. Because the bridge had been used to direct a commercial tanker, the incident triggered a secondary review related to unauthorized routing of heavy vehicles. Fines were assessed. Not against the HOA. Against her. The driver's company filed its own report, documenting that the driver had raised safety concerns and proceeded only after being assured by someone claiming authority. Their insurer took note. Suddenly, She wasn't dealing with one claim, but several, all pointing in the same direction. Her attorney asked for a private settlement again. This time, the offer was higher. Acknowledgement of fault. Confidentiality.
Speed.
I declined again. Not because I wanted to drag it out, but because settling quietly would have erased the lesson. It would have framed the bridge as a misunderstanding instead of what it was, a boundary crossed deliberately because she believed consequences could be managed. They couldn't. The board formally removed her as president before mediation concluded. Not suspended. Removed. The vote was unanimous. The minutes were published. The reason cited was loss of confidence due to actions exposing the association to severe liability. She stopped showing up to meetings altogether after that. The rebuild timeline stretched months. Temporary access solutions were installed at additional cost. Every delay translated into more documentation, more accounting, more evidence of harm. All of it was tracked. All of it attached to a single incident date. The bridge site itself became symbolic. Yellow tape replaced guardrails. The broken span stood as a reminder of what happens when authority ignores limits. Contractors shook their heads when they inspected it. Engineers didn't argue about ratings. They pointed to the video and nodded. Yeah, one said quietly. That'll do it. By the time mediation officially failed, there was nothing left to negotiate. Liability had crystallized. Responsibility was fixed. The only remaining question was how far the consequences would reach beyond the bridge itself. And as it turned out, they were about to reach further than she ever imagined. The settlement didn't come quietly. It came after months of pressure, mounting costs, and the slow realization that there was no version of the story where she walked away untouched. Her attorney requested one final meeting, not to negotiate terms, but to finalize responsibility. By then, the numbers were unavoidable. Full bridge reconstruction, environmental remediation, temporary access costs, county fines, legal fees on multiple fronts. The total eclipsed what most people associate with a single mistake. And this wasn't categorized as an accident. Every document, every report, every clip of footage reinforced the same conclusion. The damage was the result of a conscious decision.
She signed.
The agreement acknowledged sole responsibility for directing the tanker onto private infrastructure against posted warnings. It included repayment schedules, asset liens, and compliance conditions that would follow her for years. There was no confidentiality clause strong enough to erase public records, and no language vague enough to blur fault. The bridge rebuild began shortly after. This time, everything was done by the book. Engineers, inspectors, load testing, county oversight at every stage. The new structure was stronger, wider, and rated far beyond anything the original had been, but that came at a cost measured not just in money, but in time and disruption. Months passed before full access was restored. During that time, the HOA transformed. New leadership took over with a very different tone.
Decisions slowed down.
Permissions were requested instead of assumed. Contractors were required to verify access rights in writing. No one wanted to be the next example. And the residents noticed. Meetings became crowded. Questions were asked openly. Old grievances were revisited, not out of spite, but out of caution. People wanted to know where authority ended and where property rights began. That line, once ignored, was now unmistakable. As for her, she disappeared from community life entirely. The house sold.
The title changed.
But consequences don't relocate just because people do. Records persist. Judgments follow. And reputations, especially documented ones, tend to arrive before introductions ever happen. I keep the footage archived. Not for satisfaction. Not for leverage. But as a reminder of how quickly certainty turns into liability when power goes unchecked. One gesture. One assumption. One wave of the hand toward a bridge that wasn't hers to use. People sometimes ask if I regret not granting access in the first place. If cooperation could have avoided all of this. The answer is simple. Permission isn't the issue. Respect is. If she had asked, we could have talked. If she had listened, we could have planned. If she had acknowledged boundaries instead of dismissing them, the bridge would still be standing, and her career likely would be too. Instead, she chose force over consent, authority over law, speed over safety, and a 40-ton tanker made the consequences impossible to ignore. Today, when trucks cross the rebuilt bridge, they do so slowly, deliberately, and with authorization. The weight limit signs are larger now,
Clearer.
impossible to miss. Not because people didn't see them before, but because no one is willing to pretend they don't matter anymore. The bridge stands again, stronger than before. But the lesson it carries is heavier than any load rating. Private property isn't a convenience. Authority isn't ownership. And being in charge doesn't mean being right. All it takes to prove that is one decision, one camera, and the willingness to let the truth play all the way through. She learned that too late. Everyone else didn't.